The black wax on the letter had cracked in the heat, and the room smelled faintly of ceiling smoke and rain-damp wool. People liked to say you could tell a great deal about a woman by the way she spoke to a duke, but Silas had lived long enough to suspect that the truer measure was how she spoke to a man she believed could do nothing for her at all. He had been Duke of Wexmoor since he was young enough to feel the weight of the title before he understood the shape of it. By the time he was a grown man, he knew it too well. He knew the quick, bright glance that always dropped, just for a beat, to the coronet on the notepaper. He knew the softened laugh that arrived half a second too late. He knew how mothers appraised him over the rims of teacups, how daughters grew attentive when estates were mentioned, how even kindness toward him often had calculation folded inside it like a pin in hemmed cloth. There had been women who were lovely, women who were clever, women who were said by every aunt and bishop and well-meaning friend to be exactly what a man in his position ought to want. He had sat in drawing rooms full of beeswax candlelight and polished wood and heard himself admired for qualities he had never once had the chance to display: prudence, solidity, taste, generosity. It was astonishing what the world was willing to love in a rich man without ever troubling to meet him. Once, not very long before this story begins, he had nearly believed himself chosen. A certain lady had spoken to him with warmth that seemed free of arithmetic. She had asked what he read. She had disagreed with him. She had laughed too early for it to be practiced. He had thought, against his own habits, that perhaps here at last was a person who saw a man before she saw a title. And then one evening, crossing a corridor with the claret still warm in his blood, he heard her voice through a half-shut door, calm, exact, unembarrassed. She was explaining to a friend that affection was all very well, but Wexmoor came with land enough to make affection unnecessary. It was the neatness of it that wounded him, only certainty. He was not a man to be discovered, he was a position to be occupied. After that, something cold and stubborn settled in him. His friends called it discretion. His lawyer called it maturity. His old nurse, who had less reverence for dukes than most, called it loneliness, and told him so to his face. The trouble with a wound to pride is that it very quickly learns to dress itself as wisdom. Silas began to think there was no honest word to be had while his name went before him like a brass band. He discounted every compliment, mistrusted every softness, and at last found himself weary past bearing of being received everywhere and known nowhere. So when chance and distance offered him a door, he did not close it. He had gone abroad on estate business and private fatigue, meaning to be absent only a while. Then came the storm at sea, the wrecked packet spoken of in inn parlors, the muddled reports, the half-confirmed list of the lost. His servants were separated from him. His baggage went one way, his name another. By the time he understood that England had begun cautiously to consider him dead, he was standing in a borrowed room with salt dried stiff on his cuffs, and a decision opening beneath his feet like dark water. A letter could have corrected it in an hour. He did not write one. For 3 days he held himself in that little harbor town where tar, wet rope, and fish scales scented the wind, and asked what sort of man refuses his own life when it is handed back to him. The answer, if he had been braver, might have sent him home at once. But he was not brave in that particular way. He was tired, bitter, curious, and under all of it, hungry for one plain human look unclouded by title. By the 4th day he had taken another name, a thin, harmless one, Mr. Salt, and begun the first arrangements of vanishing properly. No crest, no valet, no announced return. Let the world close over him then. Let Wexmoor mourn, recover, rearrange itself. Let those who had loved the dukedom best discover how it looked with no duke inside it. What he did not know, not then, was that far from his own great house, in an off-season sea-bathing town with empty lodging windows and a bell above a shop door that stuck in damp weather, a woman named Frances Holt was shelving books in her late father's circulating library, and was about to become the one person in England from whom his name would matter least, and from whom the truth would cost most. If you'd like to stay with this story, subscribe and come on to the next part. By the end of that first week, he had come to understand that obscurity had its own weather. It smelled of wet wool drying by common fires, of seaweed left on the shingle after tidefall, of cheap tea and damp paper and coal smoke caught low under a gray sky. No one bowed to Mr. Salt. No one rushed to relieve him of silence. If he stood on the promenade with his sketchboard tucked under one arm and the salt wind lifting his hair, people looked past him the way they looked past gulls, signposts, and old benches, as one more worn thing belonging to the place. The town suited him for that very reason. In summer it had likely tried to be cheerful. One could see the remains of the effort in faded striped awnings, in lodging houses with flaking paint, in bathing machines left tilted like abandoned toys at the edge of the Strand. But now the season had run out, and what remained was truer. A widow aired blankets from an upstairs line that snapped in the wind. Two children in too thin boots dug trenches in the cold sand with oyster shells. An old man sold boiled sweets from a jar that had gone cloudy with sugar dust. And there, on the pebbled sweep below the seawall, the man who had once signed estate papers by the stack gave shilling lessons in perspective to anyone who wished to learn how a horizon held still while the water moved. He was good at it. That surprised him more than anyone. The work was simple, the earnings smaller than the coins he had once forgotten in waistcoat pockets, yet the thing itself steadied him. "No, don't chase every wave," he told a boy one morning, stooping beside a page already blurred by mist. "Draw the line that lets the waves exist." To an elderly lady with red hands and spectacles fogged by the cold, he said, "The cliff is only large because you've made the boat too timid. Give the poor boat some courage." They laughed. They tried again. He found that patience came more easily when no one wanted anything from him beyond an hour's help and perhaps a kinder opinion of their own clumsy efforts. Across from the Strand, set a little back from the road where the wind worried the paint from the window frame, stood the circulating library. The bell over the door had a tired, cracked note. Its glass showed books in orderly ranks, though the bindings had gone soft with age, and the gilt on the spines had dimmed to the color of old straw. He went in first for shelter, and then, on the second day, for a book, and on the third because he wanted to hear the woman behind the counter say good morning in that low, composed voice of hers. Frances Holt was not, in the way of drawing-room judgments, a woman much remarked upon. She had the kind of face people called sensible when they meant they had not looked long enough to see its sweetness. Her gowns were neat, brushed, and carefully altered. Her brown hair was smoothed plainly back. There was ink sometimes on the side of her finger, and once a dusting of flour on one cuff, as if shopkeeping and housekeeping had ceased in her life to be separate trades. Yet she had eyes that attended. That was what he noticed at once. When a child asked for a tale too old for him, she did not dismiss him. When a fisherman brought in a damp penny for a chapbook, ashamed of his hands on the clean counter, she took the coin as gravely as if he had laid down gold. When Mr. Salt asked for something to read and named an author few people in such a place would expect him to know, she did not blink in surprise for the pleasure of showing him up. She only turned, reached to the third shelf, and said, "If you like that one, you may like this better. It is less pleased with itself." He looked at her then, properly. A great many people speak to the useful poor with either brisk kindness or lazy contempt. Both are forms of distance. Frances spoke as if each person before her were simply there, entirely real, and owed the dignity of being answered whole. She gave a motherless child the same attention she gave the rector's wife. She did not sweeten her voice for rank or flatten it for trade. There was no performance in it, only habit. And habit, where goodness is concerned, tells more truth than flourish ever can. On his fourth visit, she handed him the book, and their fingers touched over the worn green cloth of the cover. A small thing, barely that. Yet he felt, with absurd force, the warmth of her hand through the chill of the room. "You're new to the town, Mr. Salt," she said. "Yes." "And are you likely to stay?" It was a simple question. Any man might have answered it simply, but the old instinct rose in him at once, that guarded turn of mind which weighed every harmless inquiry for hidden purpose. He hated himself a little for feeling it with her. "A week more, perhaps," he said, "unless the place grows tired of my sketches." The corner of her mouth moved. "The place is tired of almost everything, I think, but not, perhaps, of being noticed." Then she glanced down at the book he held, and something in her expression altered by a hair's breadth. Because inside the front board, where only a careful keeper of books was likely to see it, was a faint, impressed mark in the leather, a crest half rubbed away, but still too fine, too deliberate, too unlike anything a common seaside sketchmaster ought to have owned. She did not speak of the mark. That, more than any question might have done, unsettled him. Francis only laid the ledger flat with one palm, slid his book across the counter, and asked whether he preferred essays to verse in weather like this. Her tone was exactly the same. Her eyes, too, were composed. Yet he had lived too long among practiced faces not to notice the smallest change in attention. She had seen something. She had decided, at least for the moment, to let it rest, and because she did not press him, he found himself absurdly more aware of the hidden thing than if she had demanded an answer on the spot. "Essays, I think," he said. "Then take the volume you have. Poetry makes some people melancholy in rain." "And essays do not?" A little dry amusement touched her mouth. "Essays allow a person to call melancholy by longer names." He laughed before he meant to. She heard the surprise in it and lowered her gaze to the ledger again, giving him the mercy of not staring at a man caught off guard by his own pleasure. That was another thing about her. She seemed to understand instinctively where dignity lived in other people, and to step around it carefully, the way one steps around a sleeping dog rather than rousing it for no reason. There are persons who are kind in public and careless in private. Francis Holt had the rarer habit of being considerate when no credit could possibly be gained from it. He took the book and went out into the thin afternoon light with a sense that the air had sharpened. The gulls were wheeling low over the water, crying like rusty hinges. A fish cart creaked past, its smell of brine and scales following in the wind. He ought to have burned the volume the moment he saw what had caught her eye. Instead, he carried it back to his lodging and sat with it on his knees for a long while, turning the cover toward the fire, then away again, like a fool, hoping heat might erase the past without leaving ash. The crest was old. It had been stamped years earlier into the leather by a binder who served his house. One worn impression, half hidden near the hinge, no more than that. Yet such traces are the very things on which whole lives can turn. A signet pressed once into wax, a name entered in a parish book, a ring seen on the wrong hand. The world is forever rearranged by small, hard proofs. By morning he had resolved to be more careful, which in practice meant he went back to the shop as if drawn there. The bell gave that tired little crack of sound over the door. The room held the faint scent of paste, dust, and the oranges someone must have brought in from the grocer's. Francis was on a stool by the side shelves, reaching up to restore a volume whose spine had split. A ladder stood beside her. He crossed it once to steady it, more from instinct than manners. You'll slip, he said. I generally don't. Generally is not the same thing as never. She looked down at him then, one hand still braced on the shelf. That is a very schoolmasterish remark from a man who draws boats for children. An itinerant drawing master must guard his authority somehow. This time she smiled outright. It transformed her. She softened. The gravity in her face made room for light, and because the change was so seldom given, it struck him with more force than beauty shown off ever had. When she came down, she did not move away at once. Mr. Salt, she said, dusting her fingertips together, where did you learn to read bindings? He kept still. Bindings? You looked at that cover yesterday as if you knew exactly what leather ought to tell you. He could have lied easily. He had been lying for weeks by then, after all. But lies are clumsiest where one most wishes to be believed. My father had books, he said. Had he? Yes. She watched him a moment longer, neither accusing nor credulous, only attentive in that exacting, quiet way of hers. Then she reached behind her and drew out a thin parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. A child left this for you, she said. Tom Harker, the boy with the ink on his cuffs. He says his mother can't pay for another lesson till market day, but he wanted you to have the first sketch he made that looked, in his view, less like a collapsed pudding. Silas took the parcel. Inside was a little page of rough paper, cold from the room, with the sea badly drawn and the horizon wavering, but a boat upon it standing unexpectedly brave. He improved, Silas said quietly. He says you told him to give the poor boat some courage. Did he? He did. Frances paused. Children repeat truth more faithfully than adults do. The words landed between them more gently than suspicion, and more firmly than chance, and before he could decide how to answer, the bell above the door sounded again, and a stranger stepped in out of the salt wind, carrying a letter with black edging and Silas's false name written on it in a hand he knew at once. Silas knew the hand before the messenger had crossed half the shop. Some scripts bring back a whole former life with one glance. This one did. Thin, precise, inward-leaning letters, black-edged paper, the sort used when grief wishes to look respectable. It belonged to Mr. Penrith, his family solicitor, who had been writing him dutiful, unanswered letters into what the rest of England had agreed to call the sea. To see that hand now, above the false name of Salt, in Francis Holt's quiet shop with its smell of paste and dust and oranges, made the room feel suddenly too small. The stranger, a commercial traveler by the look of his weathered valise, pulled off one glove and asked, Mr. Salt? Silas answered at once. Yes. I was told at the inn you might be found here. You were correctly told. His voice was even. He took the letter before the man could glance from his face to Francis's and begin making comparisons. The traveler nodded, satisfied to have finished his errand, and went out again with a gust of cold air and the sound of cartwheels grinding over the damp road. The bell gave its cracked note behind him. Then there were only the two of them, the closed door and that black-bordered envelope in Silas's hand like a live thing. Frances had bent her head to the ledger once more. He did not know whether she did it for his sake or her own. Her lashes cast small shadows on her cheek. One finger rested between the pages to keep her place, though she was not truly reading the line before her. He knew because he too had spent years becoming skillful at the management of appearances. You need not open it here, she said after a moment. The kindness of that, the refusal to pry, touched him more sharply than curiosity would have done. Thank you. You are welcome, Mr. Salt. The false name, spoken so calmly, was harder to bear now than if she had challenged it. He went out without another word and crossed the road to the seawall, where the wind off the water was keen enough to sting his eyes. A spray of cold brine touched his cheek. He broke the seal with his thumb. The letter was brief, which told him at once that matters were no longer ordinary. Penrith was not a brief man by nature. "My lord," it began, and there was no escape in those 2 words. "Rumors of your survival, once absurd, are now beginning to gather shape. Your cousin, Mr. Adrian Vale, has entered Wexmore House and acts in all but name as presumptive master. Certain tenants have been encouraged to regard the succession as settled. I beg you to understand that continued silence may soon render matters irretrievable. If you live, you must either return or give me leave to declare you alive. Delay has ceased to be private." Below that, added in haste, was 1 line more. "A gentleman asking questions in your late traveling circle has already passed through the coast road towns." Silas stood with the paper snapping faintly in the wind. He could almost smell the great house in that moment, beeswax and old stone, the leather of the library chairs, autumn fires laid before dusk. He saw Adrian, too, clear as if the man stood before him, handsome in the polished way some men are, always smooth, always agreeable, always turning his head slightly when listening so that you might notice how carefully he appeared to listen. Adrian had never openly envied him. Open envy belongs to simpler tempers, but he had long possessed the quieter hunger of one who thought another's place would fit him better than his own. And now, because Silas had been wounded and vain and tired, he had handed that man an empty throne to sit upon. He folded the letter once, twice, and slipped it inside his coat. The sea before him was slate-colored, ribbed by the wind. Down the strand, children were chasing one another between puddles left by the tide. Their voices came thin and bright through the air. Behind him, across the road, the window of the circulating library held a faint reflection of the sky. Francis moved within it, no more than a shape passing between shelves. He might have gone then. A sensible man would have done it that hour, packed what little he owned under the false name, hired a seat north, and resumed the life he had thrown aside. Yet sense, where the heart is concerned, rarely arrives clean and whole. It comes mixed with hope, fear, vanity, longing, and the shame of wanting one more day. When he returned the next afternoon, Frances was on her knees by a low shelf, sorting returned volumes into a wooden crate lined with newspaper. The room was warmer than before. A kettle hissed somewhere in the back. Rain tapped the window panes in a soft, quick pattern. She looked up. "You came back." It was such a small sentence, only that. But it carried something he had not expected to hear from anyone, anywhere, after all he had done with his name. "Yes," he said. And then she rose, brushed the dust from her skirt, and held out to him a slim book wrapped in blue paper. "I thought," she said, "since you had an urgent letter yesterday, you might prefer something better than your own thoughts tonight." He took the parcel, and with it the first dangerous warmth he had felt in many years. But as his fingers closed over the book, he saw on the counter behind her a visiting card he had never seen before. Creamy, expensive, and engraved with the name Adrian Vale. His hand tightened on the blue-wrapped book before he could stop it. Frances saw the movement. Of course she did. She missed very little that happened in her own shop. She turned, followed his glance to the card by the inkstand, and said in that same even voice, "A gentleman called this morning. He asked whether I kept county maps, bathing guides, or local directories. I told him I kept more novels than geography, which seemed to disappoint him." Silas set the parcel down with deliberate care. The card lay near the inkstand, cream stock, sharp black engraving, Adrian Vale. The sight of that name in the circulating library, among cracked spines and subscription slips and Frances's careful ledgers, produced in him a strange coldness, as if some polished creature from his old life had trailed mud across a clean kitchen floor. "Did you know him?" Francis asked. "No," he said too quickly, and then, because one lie so often calls for a second, "That is, I know the name only by hearing it." She neither accepted nor challenged that. She only lifted the card by its corner and placed it beneath a paperweight shaped like a shell. "He had the look of a man who expects people to remember him. The town did not oblige." That made him smile despite himself. Adrian hated being unrecognized. Few discomforts pricked such men more sharply than being mistaken for ordinary. "He was very civil," Francis went on, "which, in my experience, may mean almost anything. He asked whether strangers had lately taken lodgings here for a long stay, whether any gentlemen kept to themselves, whether anyone gave lessons upon the shore." The rain at the window seemed suddenly louder. "And what did you tell him?" "The truth in small portions. That many people keep to themselves here because the weather is poor and life is tiresome, that the shore is full of people attempting livelihoods no one expected to need, that I do not make a practice of discussing my subscribers." He looked at her then, properly. "Thank you." She tilted her head a little. "I did not do it for you in particular, Mr. Salt. I dislike questions asked as if they are claims." There it was again, that plain instinct in her that always went to the root of a thing. Some people resent interference only when it touches them. Francis resented it as a matter of order. It offended her sense of how one human being ought to approach another. The same feeling that made her answer a fisherman courteously, and a rector's wife no more than courteously, was at work here too. A person reveals himself most clearly where he thinks manners need not apply. He ought to have left then. Instead, he stayed while she tied up parcels for 2 subscribers, and then longer still while a boy returned a library book, sticky with toffee at the corners, and received, from Francis, a mild rebuke so just and dry that the child went away grinning. Silas found himself telling her, almost without intending it, that Tom Harker had improved again and would soon begin drawing the sea as if it were water rather than wallpaper. "That is promising," she said, "and useful." "Useful?" "I have been thinking," she said, setting her hands lightly on the counter, "that if the weather remains too poor for the promenade, the children will go wild indoors and their mothers with them. If I were to clear the rear room one afternoon next week, would you give a small lesson here? Nothing grand. A shilling each, perhaps less for the little ones. It might bring in custom for you, and for the shop, though I confess I am chiefly thinking of preserving the town from anarchy." He stared at her. "In the back room of the library?" "If you dislike the idea, say so." "I do not dislike it." "Then why look so alarmed?" Because no one had asked anything of him in years that was at once so modest and so trusting. Because she had made room for him in the pattern of her days like the most natural thing in the world. Because she was offering him a place, not as duke, not as heir, not as a prize catch for some ambitious mother, but as a useful man with charcoal on his cuffs and patience enough for children. "When?" he asked. "Thursday, if you can." "I can." "Good." She reached for her pencil, made a note in the margin of a blotter, then paused. "There is one more thing. The gentleman with the card asked whether I had ever seen an impression like this." From the drawer beneath the counter she drew a scrap of paper. Pressed into a dab of dark wax, rough but unmistakable, was half a crest. Not his full arms, but near enough to chill him to the bone. "He said it might belong to a trunk stolen on the road," Francis said quietly. "Mr. Salt, why do I think that was a lie?" For a second he said nothing at all. The scrap of paper lay between them on the counter, the dark wax dulled where Adrian's thumb must have pressed it. Rain whispered against the glass. Somewhere in the back room the kettle gave a soft ticking sound as it settled off the boil. Frances did not withdraw the paper, and she did not push it closer. She only waited, which is often the hardest thing to bear when one is already ashamed. "Because he was lying," Silas said at last. Her eyes stayed on his face. "That much I had gathered." He let out a breath he had not known he was holding. "Then why ask?" "Because there are lies told for convenience, and lies told because something is wrong." Her fingers rested lightly on the counter edge. He had the second sort. He could have evaded her again. He had become uncomfortably skilled at that. Yet some part of him, the part that had come to this gray town wanting one honest exchange before he died in earnest or in rumor, could not quite bring itself to lie to her when she had already given him more trust than he deserved. "That seal belongs to a family," he said carefully. "A real one, not to any stolen trunk." "Yours?" He looked up fast. She did not sound triumphant. She sounded tired, as if she had been fitting pieces together for several days and had only now set the last one down. "My father dealt in books," she said quietly. "Books go through many houses before they come to mine. Crests, inscriptions, gift plates, mourning ribbons. One notices things. Then there was the leather mark in your volume, and the way you looked at it. Then yesterday's letter. Then this gentleman with his smooth questions and poor invention. I am not a genius, Mr. Salt, only a woman who keeps her eyes open because she cannot afford not to." That touched him more deeply than accusation would have done. To be clearly seen by a person of sense is a relief right beside terror. He had wanted, in some unworthy chamber of his heart, to be known without the burden of his name. He had not considered what it might feel like when someone began, patiently, to know him anyway. "I am not in danger from him," Frances went on. "At least, I think not yet. But I dislike being made part of a puzzle without my consent." He almost smiled at the steadiness of that. Principle first. "You are right to dislike it." "Then help me understand why I should go on tolerating it." A great many speeches occurred to him and died at once. He could not tell her the truth. Not yet. Adrian was already sniffing along the coast road, and the words spoken badly here could carry farther than either of them meant. Yet if he said too little, he would insult her. If he said too much, he might place her in real peril. "There is a matter of inheritance tangled up in it," he said, "and a man who benefits if certain questions remain unanswered." "Are you that man?" "No." "Are you hiding from him?" "Yes." She absorbed that. He saw her do it. Her gaze dropped briefly to the wax, then back to him. "And is he hiding from the truth?" "Yes." That answer seemed to settle something in her. She folded the scrap once and slid it back into the drawer. "Very well." He blinked. "Very well?" "I did not say I approved." Her tone had a dry edge now, and it oddly comforted him. "I said I understood enough to stop asking foolish questions in the middle of the shop. If you mean to go on being mysterious, at least have the courtesy to do it where customers cannot overhear." Then, before he could answer, she moved past him toward the back room and held the door half open. "Since you have already agreed to Thursday, you may as well inspect the battlefield." He followed her. The room behind the shop was narrow and low-ceilinged, with a small grate, 2 long tables, and stacks of unsorted books in wooden crates. The air smelled of paste, damp wool, and the ghost of old coal smoke sunk into the curtains. A cracked globe leaned in the corner. Rainlight from the little window gave everything a softened, bluish cast. It was not much of a classroom, but he could see at once what she intended. Children at the long table, copy paper by the window, charcoal in saucers, the globe turned so they might laugh at countries they would never see. "It will do," he said. "It must." She set a crate down with both hands and brushed a strand of hair back with her wrist. "Mrs. Cleeve has promised to send her 2 boys if I keep them from drawing soldiers shooting one another. Tom Harker is coming. Perhaps the fishmonger's niece as well, if she can be spared. I thought tea buns afterward if I can manage them." "You have planned the whole thing." "Of course I have." He stood looking at her, and something in his expression must have shifted, because she paused and said more softly, "You needn't look startled every time a person expects you to be useful." The words entered him like warmth. Only that plain assumption that he could be of use and might wish to be. Then the bell in the front shop gave its cracked little ring. Francis turned at once. So did he. A man's voice carried faintly through the shelves, smooth, well-bred, and familiar enough to turn Silas cold where he stood. "Miss Holt," Adrian said from the other room, "forgive the intrusion. I wonder whether you might spare me another moment." The sound of Adrian's voice seemed to thin the air in the little back room. Silas did not move at first. He felt, with that old involuntary sharpness of the hunted, every narrow fact of the place at once. The smell of damp curtains, the stack of atlases by the wall, the half-cleared table meant for children's paper and charcoal, Francis standing not 3 feet from him, with one hand still on the crate she had set down. He had not understood until that instant how completely the town had begun to feel separate from his old life. Adrian's voice crossing the front threshold was like finding soot on fresh linen. Francis looked at him once, quickly. It was measuring. "Does he know you are here?" "I don't know." "That is not the answer to the question I asked." "No," he said. "I don't think so." She gave one short nod. Then, before he could say another word, she stepped past him into the shop. He followed as far as the doorway and stopped in the shadow of the shelves. It was a miserable position for a man who had once owned half a county, to stand hidden behind travel books and sermons, while his cousin smiled at the woman whose quiet good opinion he had somehow come to value more than the deference of rooms full of titled people. Yet humiliation is sometimes only accuracy arriving late. He had chosen concealment. Concealment was now choosing for him. Adrian stood by the counter, gloves in one hand, hat in the other, elegant as ever and warmed by his own confidence. He wore mourning black of excellent cut. His dark hair was brushed smooth. Rain had left small bright drops on his coat collar. He looked, to any ordinary eye, like what he always wished to appear. A gentleman, obliged by grief to attend to tiresome business, with patience and feeling. "Miss Holt," he said, bowing slightly, "forgive me. I fear I was abrupt this morning." "You were curious," Francis replied. His smile deepened. A fair correction. Silas could not see her face fully from where he stood, but he knew her voice already well enough to hear the degree of distance in it. Only a cool refusal to make a stranger comfortable before he had earned it. One learns a great deal from what a person thinks he may take for granted. Adrian, like many men who had always found doors opened before them, mistook civility for access. "I have been making inquiries," Adrian went on, lightly resting 2 fingers on the counter edge, "about a gentleman who may have passed through the town under a name not his own." Francis said, "That sounds inconvenient for him." For one perfect second, Silas nearly laughed. He did not. Adrian, however, gave no sign of offense. He was too practiced to show impatience when charm might still serve. "Inconvenient, yes, though perhaps more inconvenient for those who unknowingly assist him. I should hate for any respectable house to be drawn into another person's private difficulty." There was the first note of pressure, gentle as silk over a wire. Francis folded a receipt and set it aside. "If you mean to warn me, sir, you should do so plainly. I have never liked advice that arrives dressed as fog." Something moved in Adrian's expression then, so slight most people would have missed it, a tightening at the mouth, an adjustment behind the eyes. He was accustomed to softer resistance than this. He had expected, perhaps, a provincial shopkeeper, grateful for notice and easily nudged by social tone. He had met instead a woman who treated a gentleman's polish the same way she treated rain on the windows, as a condition to be observed, not deferred to. "My dear Miss Holt," he said, with more warmth than before. "Plainly, then, there are impostors in the world, men who trade on borrowed manners, borrowed learning, borrowed histories. If such a person attached himself to your establishment, I should think it only friendly to say he may leave unpleasantness behind him." Silas saw Francis's hand come to rest on the blotter. Still, controlled. He knew suddenly that she was angry. Not for herself alone, though Adrian was indeed trespassing upon her peace. Angry because he had presumed a right to trouble her house, and to do it by insinuation. Some injuries do not have to be large to be clearly seen by a just mind. The world is full of people who are courteous upward and careless downward. Francis Holt had no patience with that species. "I keep books," she said, "not confessions. If you have a business with a particular man, you may take it to him directly. And if I cannot find him directly, then you must improve your search." Adrian's smile held. His eyes did not. He turned slightly, looking around the little shop as if it had only then occurred to him to notice how small it was, how worn, how vulnerable. "One hopes," he murmured, "that no misunderstanding should ever damage a place so easily damaged." Silas felt the blood leave his face. Because Adrian had said it softly, pleasantly, almost regretfully, and Francis, hearing it too, went very still. Then the bell above the door gave another quick, cracked ring, and Tom Harker came stumbling in out of the rain with his sketchboard under one arm, his cheeks red from the wind, and called out in happy ignorance, "Mr. Salt, I've come early." Tom stopped dead with the rain still shining on his hair. Children do not enter a room the way adults do. They burst into its truth before anyone has time to arrange the furniture of appearance. The boy stood there panting a little, clutching his sketchboard, his boots leaving small wet crescents on the floorboards, and looked from Francis to the elegant stranger to the shadowed doorway where Silas stood half-concealed among the shelves. Adrian turned. It was only a turn of the head, a mild gentleman's glance towards some interruption in a provincial shop, yet Silas felt his whole body go still. His cousin's eyes passed over him, returned, and lingered. Not quite recognition, but the first pricking of it, perhaps. A man may change his name, his coat, his manner of living, even the very shape of his days. It is harder to change the bones of his face. Francis moved first. "Yes, Tom," she said, with such calm good sense that the whole scene seemed at once to belong to her again. "You have come early. Wipe your boots, if you please, and speak one person's name at a time." The boy, reddening, scrubbed his feet on the mat. "Sorry, Miss Holt, I only meant—" "I know what you meant." Then she turned to Adrian with cool courtesy. "This is Mr. Salt, who gives the sketch lessons I mentioned. Mr. Salt, Mr. Vale." The introduction hung there, plain as bread, and because it was plain, it was brilliant. No flutter, no apology, no explanation. She had set him in the room as exactly what he claimed to be, and in so doing left Adrian no dignified way to dispute it without showing his hand. Adrian bowed slightly. "Mr. Salt." Silas stepped forward because he must. "Sir." He kept his voice lower than usual. The two men looked at one another across the counter, and though Tom shifted his board from hand to hand, and the rain tapped at the panes, and the kettle hissed faintly in the back room, the shop seemed all at once close and airless. Adrian smiled. "I hear you are quite useful in the town." I try to earn my keep. An admirable ambition." His gaze slid briefly to Silas's hands, to the charcoal smudge at one cuff, then back to his face. "And have you been long in these parts?" "Long enough to know the weather is honest, if nothing else." It was a dangerous answer, too dry, too level. Francis heard it. He knew she did. Something flickered in her eyes, not warning exactly, but attention sharpened to a point. Adrian gave a soft laugh. "Honest weather is rarer than honest men." Tom, who had no use for polished threats and wanted only to know whether there would still be a lesson, blurted, "Mr. Salt says boats need courage." The silence that followed was so absurd that Francis nearly smiled. Silas saw the effort of composure in the corner of her mouth and could have loved her for it then and there, though he would not yet call the feeling by that name. "Does he?" Adrian said. "He does," Tom answered earnestly. "Else they turn into puddings." "Tom," said Francis. "Sorry." Adrian looked at the boy, then at Silas again, and some of the smooth ease left him. Children, old servants, dogs, horses, the poor, the inconveniently plain-spoken. These are the witnesses vanity hates most, because they respond to character before position. What Adrian saw in that moment was not proof, but something nearly as troubling. This supposed nobody was rooted here already. He had a child's loyalty, Miss Holt's professional respect, and the easy, unperformed place of a man expected tomorrow. "Well," Adrian said at last, putting on his gloves finger by finger, "I would not wish to interrupt instruction." "Miss Holt, you have been clarifying." "That is kind of you to say," she replied, meaning the opposite so gently that only a fool would have missed it. He bowed again. "Mr. Salt." Silas inclined his head. Adrian went to the door, paused with his hand on the latch, and turned back as if recalling some small social courtesy. "One thing more. If your pupils draw the sea this week, tell them not to trust calm water too readily. It has a way of giving back what people think it has taken." Then he left. The bell snapped above the door. Cold air moved through the shop and was gone. Tom let out a breath like a punctured bellows. "I don't like him," he announced. "No," said Francis softly, eyes still on the closed door. "Neither do I." She stood very still for a moment, one hand resting on the counter, and then at last she turned to Silas. The boy was there. The lesson was waiting. The back room smelled of wet wool and chalk and tea buns not yet baked. Everything ordinary remained in place, but her gaze had changed. "Mr. Salt," she said, low enough that Tom could not hear, "I think it is time you told me why a dead man's cousin has just come hunting through my shop." The question had to wait. There are moments when life, with its usual disrespect for timing, sets a child's wet boots directly on the threshold of catastrophe and asks grown people to mind both at once. Tom Harker, having delivered his happy cry into the middle of danger, now stood looking from one face to another with the blunt anxiety of the young who know something is wrong long before they know what. Francis spared him at once. She took his sketchboard, set it by the back room door, and told him to fetch the charcoal saucers from the shelf if he wanted to be useful. The commission transformed him. He ran to it. When two more children came in with streaming hems and red noses, and then Mrs. Cleeve's twins burst from the rain like cannon fire in boots, the little library had filled with the rustle and clatter of ordinary necessity. Silas should have been grateful for the reprieve. Instead, he felt the strain of it all through the lesson. He stood at the long table with damp paper under his fingers and tried to teach horizons, roofs, and the patient business of looking before drawing, while the back of his mind tracked every sound from the shop, every passing wheel in the street, every possibility of Adrian waiting just beyond the rain-streaked window. Yet the children, as children do, dragged him into the present by requiring it of him. One boy pressed so hard his charcoal snapped. A little girl in a yellow ribbon asked why clouds were harder than cliffs. Tom solemnly produced a boat the size of a church and looked wounded when the others laughed. Silas bent over the page and said, "No, keep it. If a boat is too large, the sea must learn humility." Even Frances, carrying in a tray of tea buns warm enough to sweeten the room with yeast and spice, let out a quiet breath of laughter at that. She moved among them with sleeves turned back, ink long washed from her hands, the sharpness of the earlier scene folded away for the children's sake. But he knew now how much discipline such composure cost her. She passed buns, straightened elbows, rescued a library atlas from jam-stained fingers, and never once looked as if she were counting how to confront a man who had just been named, however indirectly, beside a death. Silas, watching her over the bowed heads at the table, felt two things at once: admiration and guilt so clean it had no defense left in it. The better he came to know her, the less innocent his silence seemed. When the last child had gone, carrying soggy sketches and crumbs and loud goodbyes into the evening, the little back room fell into a tired hush. Rain still whispered at the window. The grate gave off a low red glow. Frances stood gathering the cups, and he began, "Miss Holt, take those to the kitchen if you please," she said, handing him the tray before he spoke. It was not avoidance exactly. It was management. She was setting tasks between them because tasks are simpler than revelations, and because once a woman runs a place alone, she learns that even dread may be postponed by washing cups. He took the tray. He carried it through the narrow passage to the tiny back kitchen where the air smelled of soap, damp coal, and orange peel. When he returned, she was tying the day's pennies into a square of cloth. "You were good with them," she said without looking up. "I like them." "I know. Children are rarely mistaken about who likes them." That, too, was a kind of judgment, a gentle one, still a judgment. She set the little cloth purse aside and wiped the counter with a folded rag, though it was already clean. "You asked me a question," he said. "Yes?" "I mean to answer it." "Do you?" She laid the rag flat. "And will the answer be true?" He had no right to flinch at that, yet he did. "As far as I can make it." Only then did she meet his eyes. The room had grown dim. The last of the afternoon had gone to iron at the window panes. In that softened light, her face seemed both younger and more tired, as if duty had worn fine lines into someone who had once expected an easier life and long ago stopped expecting it. "I do not care who your father was," she said quietly. "I do not care whether you were bred in a cottage or a great house. I do care very much if a man with mourning on his sleeve comes into my circulating library and hints that my livelihood may be crushed because of another person's secret. If I am already in danger, I prefer the plain shape of it." He drew breath. This, then, was the moment that had been coming toward him since the first cracked seal, the first half-seen crest, when she had looked at him as if he were simply a man standing there and worth the trouble of answering honestly. "My name is not Salt," he said. Her face did not change. That was somehow worse than surprise. "I thought not." "My name is Silas." A beat passed. The fire shifted in the grate. Then, from the front of the shop, the bell gave a single broken ring, and a woman's anxious voice called out through the shelves, "Miss Holt? Forgive me, there is a gentleman outside asking whether this is where a man called Silas has been seen?" Frances did not start, though the voice from the shop would have startled most people. That, too, Silas noticed. Her hand only tightened once against the edge of the counter, then loosened again. She gave him one swift look, as if measuring whether he meant to run, deny, or trust her, and then she said very quietly, "Stay here." He almost obeyed. Almost. But a man who has already let too much fall on another person's shoulders grows ashamed, eventually, of hiding behind good women's steadiness. By the time Francis had crossed the narrow passage and reached the front room, he had followed as far as the shadow behind the periodical stand. From there he could see the open door, the wet street beyond it, and Mrs. Bell, the elderly widow who took lessons on Tuesdays and returned her books with lavender tucked between the pages. She was breathing fast from haste and weather. Raindrops clung to the veil of her bonnet. "Forgive me, Miss Holt," she said. "There is a gentleman outside in a dark carriage asking after a Mr. Silas. He described—" Her eyes flicked past Francis, searching the room, then landed for a fraction of a second on the figure behind the stand. Mrs. Bell was no fool. "Well," she finished with admirable tact, "he described someone who might, perhaps, be known to you." "Did he give a name?" Francis asked. "No, only urgency, and manners polished enough to make me distrust him." That, from Mrs. Bell, amounted to a trumpet blast. Silas stepped forward then. There was no use in making two women perform courage for him while he stood among magazines pretending not to exist. "He is likely connected to Mr. Vale," he said. Mrs. Bell's brows rose, but she asked no useless questions. She belonged to that older, better-bred sort of person who understood that panic wastes time. Francis turned to him fully now, her face pale in the fading light. "Is it another of his men?" "Possibly, or my solicitor." "Your what?" He closed his eyes for the briefest instant. Too much had already slipped free in fragments. Bits of truth are often crueler than a whole confession. They oblige the listener to do the work of understanding while one stands by in cowardice. He had done enough of that. "My solicitor," he said again. "His name is Penrith. If it is he, then he has found me sooner than I expected. If it is not he, then we are out of time." Mrs. Bell, who had been drying one glove finger by finger with a severe little handkerchief, said, "My carriage is not handsome, but it is at the side lane, and no one ever notices a widow if she looks cross enough. If someone must leave unseen, there is your road." Francis looked from the older woman to Silas. He saw the calculation begin in her, swift and unwilling. Not whether to help him, whether helping him would drag the library deeper into danger, whether standing aside from danger would make her the sort of woman she despised. One learns a great deal about a person by the moment in which convenience and conscience part company. Francis had not yet chosen, and already he feared the cost of whichever choice she made. "Thank you," he said to Mrs. Bell. She sniffed. "Do not thank me yet. I have not decided whether you are worth saving." Against all the strain of the moment, Francis almost smiled. "That is the most encouraging thing anyone has said all day." Then she looked at him, and the smile was gone. "If this is your solicitor, why is he asking in the street for a man called Silas? You were about to tell me something, and now I think you were about to tell me far too little." He met her gaze. There was no softness in it now, but there was something sterner and rarer than softness. She intended to know the truth, and intended that it should be the truth entire. "Because," he said, "Silas is my given name, but not the name that matters." Her eyes did not leave his face. Outside, the rain had thinned to a fine silver drift over the lamps being lit one by one along the street. The horse in the waiting carriage stamped once on the wet stones. Somewhere farther down the road a porter shouted and a door banged. The whole shabby little town went on breathing its ordinary breath, while inside that worn shop the air seemed to narrow around a single point. Mrs. Bell folded her damp handkerchief and said, in the tone of a woman who has lived long enough to dislike suspense on principle, "Young man, Either speak plainly or get into my carriage before plainness is no longer available to you." He exhaled. "I am not Mr. Salt," he said to Francis, "and I am not merely a man being pursued over some private estate dispute. My cousin believes me dead. The man you met today expects, if I remain dead, to inherit everything I have left behind." Mrs. Bell went still. Francis did not move at all. Silas heard his own voice change as the last defense in it gave way. "My name is Silas Wren. I am the Duke of Wexmoor." And from the street outside, almost at once, another voice called through the rain, clear and official and impossible to mistake. "Your Grace, if you are within, for God's sake answer." For one suspended instant, nobody in the shop seemed to breathe. The rain outside had gone soft, almost silvery, and through it the lamps on the street burned in little blurred halos. The voice that had called out to him was nearer now, close enough that he could hear the strain in it. Penrith never raised his voice unless necessity had stripped him of every other method. Mrs. Bell closed her eyes briefly, as if the world had confirmed a tiresome suspicion. Francis stood with one hand still on the counter, looking at Silas as though the room had shifted under her feet, and she refused, by some private act of dignity, to stagger with it. He moved first. When he opened the door, the wet evening came in with him, cold and smelling of horse, rain, and the sea. A dark carriage stood at the curb. Beside it, collar damp and hair blown loose from its usual discipline, was Mr. Penrith. The solicitor's lined face changed at once when he saw him. Relief passed through it so nakedly that even now, even here, it touched Silas. "Thank God," Penrith said, not caring who heard. "Your Grace." The title sounded monstrous in that little street. Too large, too polished. It did not belong among dripping shop fronts and blown posters and children's chalk washed pale from the paving stones. Yet it belonged to him, and because it did, every lie of the last weeks seemed suddenly to stand up around him in a row. "Get inside," Silas said. They all returned to the shop, bringing rain and urgency with them. Penrith took off his gloves with impatient fingers, nodded to Mrs. Bell, bowed automatically to Francis, and then turned back to his master with the expression of a man who has rehearsed 10 arguments and means to use whichever one will do the work quickest. "I have searched 3 towns," he said in a low voice. "Adrian is ahead of us in rumor, if not in proof. He has been received at Wexmoor House. The tenants are being approached, and 2 papers are already drafting notices on the succession. If he fixes the story of your death in enough minds, undoing it becomes a scandal instead of a correction." Francis heard that. Of course she did. Silas heard her hearing it, though she made no sound. Penrith went on. "And worse, he has begun asking after any person who might contradict him. He knows someone has seen you. He may not know who yet, but he is narrowing it." At that, the solicitor's eyes flicked once, just once, toward Francis. It was a tiny thing. Enough. Silas felt shame rise in him like heat. He had brought danger over her threshold with his silence and his need, and now another man had looked at her and measured risk because of him. "Miss Holt is not part of this," he said sharply. Penrith, who had served 3 generations of his family and could hear guilt under anger as plainly as thunder behind hills, answered with brutal honesty. "She already is." Mrs. Bell made a small, dissatisfied noise in her throat, the sort made by sensible women when men have finally arrived at the point they should have begun from. Francis had not moved. That was what Silas would remember later. Not tears, not exclamation, not dramatic injury, but that terrible composure. When she spoke, her voice was level. "You have all had an astonishing deal of information about my life without once troubling to ask whether I should like it." No one answered. There was no answer fit to give. She looked at Penrith first. "You may sit down, sir. You are dripping on my floor." Penrith, bewildered into obedience, sat. Then she looked at Silas. He would have preferred anger. Anger at least admits heat, and heat can change. This was something colder and more exacting. She was not yet judging him, because she had not yet finished understanding what he had done. And that pause in judgment frightened him more than any quick condemnation might have done. "You told me your name was Silas," she said. "Yes." "That then was true." "Yes." "And the rest?" He opened his mouth. Nothing sufficient came. The little shop smelled of wet wool, extinguished tea, and old paper. Somewhere in the back room a coal settled with a soft crack. Penrith, perhaps sensing at last that law, rank, and practical alarm had all become secondary to another kind of reckoning, said quietly, "Your Grace, the leather case." Silas turned. "What?" "You left it in the carriage, the one with the papers, and the seal." Francis's eyes sharpened at that last word. A moment later there came, from just beyond the open door, a hard knock against wood, as if someone outside, less patient than Penrith, had laid a hand on the carriage case and found it locked. The knock against the case seemed to strike the whole room. Silas was at the door in 2 strides. Cold rain brushed his face as he stepped onto the threshold, and there, bent over the dark leather case in Penrith's carriage, was not Adrian, nor one of his hired men, but the inn porter's boy, all elbows and wet cap, jerking back at once with the offended innocence of the young. "Beg pardon, sir," the boy stammered. "I was only seeing if it were properly shut. A gentleman below said a case had been tampered with on the road, and I thought—" "Go home," Silas said. The boy went. Under the draper's awning, 2 figures stood in rain and lamplight. One was broad in the shoulder, local. The other held himself too neatly for the town, watching. When Silas lifted his head, that second figure turned away with studied casualness and moved on. He knew that sort of retreat. Men who wished not to be noticed were often conspicuous by the very care with which they seemed not to look. He took the case himself and carried it inside. When the door closed, the shop felt smaller than before. The lamps had been lit now. Their glow turned the gilt on the bindings soft and yellow, and deepened the hollows beneath Francis's eyes. Penrith rose halfway from his chair, then sat again when Silas set the case on the counter. "It has the papers," the solicitor said. "The notices from town, the letters, and—" "I heard you." Penrith fell quiet. Francis was looking at the case like some 5th person in the room, one more stranger brought into her shop without permission. Mrs. Bell, who had kept a dry and severe silence through the interruption, took off her spectacles, polished them with methodical displeasure, and put them back on. "Well," she said, "if we are to be ruined by secrets, I should like mine in good order." Silas almost laughed. He did not. There was too much ash in him for it. He touched the lock and felt, absurdly, the old trained instinct rise in him once more, that reluctance to open anything under witnesses, to let private authority spill into common view. And then he saw Francis watching him, not with awe, not with curiosity, but with the exhausted patience of a woman who has had enough concealment to last the rest of her life. So he opened it. Inside lay folded documents tied in red tape, a traveling ink case, 2 packets of letters, and the seal Penrith had mentioned, heavy and gold, wrapped in a square of dark velvet. That small object altered the air at once. The thing itself was mute, of course. Metal has no voice. Yet power has a way of speaking before it is used. Francis knew now that the faint impression in the sketchbook had not been some grand fancy of hers. Here was the hand of it. Here was the hard proof that the man who had stood in the back room teaching children to draw boats brave enough for weather had also carried, tucked out of sight, the means to stamp commands into wax. Penrith cleared his throat. "Miss Holt, I must ask your pardon. None of this should ever have touched you." "No," Frances said. "It should not." Her voice was quiet. That was worse than outrage. Mrs. Bell, hearing it too, turned her gaze upon Silas with the chill exactness of a magistrate who has already heard enough. He took out the top letter and laid it beside the seal. "You asked for plainness," he said to Frances. "I have given you fragments and made you do the labor of fitting them together. That was ungenerous. It ends now." She said nothing. "I was reported drowned abroad. I learned of it before the report fixed itself completely, and I let it stand. My cousin benefits if I remain dead. At first I told myself I wanted rest, then that I wanted truth. What I meant was that I was tired of being approached as a title and not a man, and I chose a coward's remedy. I stepped out of my own life and came here under another name." Mrs. Bell shut her eyes briefly, as if to say she had expected folly, though perhaps not such expensive folly. Penrith stared hard at the shelf opposite him. He had likely heard most of this in pieces from his own deductions, but hearing it named so plainly by the man himself was another matter. Frances listened without interrupting. That, too, was terrible. She did not save him by protesting. She did not soften what he had done by hurrying him past it. "And when you came to my shop?" she asked at last. The question was so level that, for one weak instant, he wished she had raised her voice. "I came meaning to be no one," he said. Her gaze sharpened. "That is not what I asked." No, it was not. Outside, wheels passed through shallow rainwater with a soft hiss. Inside, the lamp flame moved once in a draught and steadied. Silas looked at the open case, at the gold seal, at the letters tied with red tape, at the whole dressed machinery of the life he had set aside. Then he looked back at Frances Holt, and because there was no honorable answer left but the ugliest one, he said, "I came meaning to find out what sort of woman you were before you knew what sort of man I was." The words did not seem at first to alter her face. They altered the room. Frances stood very still behind her counter, with the opened case, the gold seal, the tied papers, the smell of rain and old bindings all around her, and looked at him as though the whole arrangement of the last weeks had shifted backward into some cold and ugly pattern she had not chosen to see until now. Mrs. Bell, who had begun by disliking secrecy on practical grounds, now disliked it on moral ones, which was a more dangerous thing. Penrith kept his eyes lowered. Even he, who had come in haste and necessity, had the decency to understand that this part of the matter did not belong to law. "What sort of woman I was," Frances repeated. Silas said nothing. "You came into my shop under a false name. You took books from my hands. You stood in that back room with children and charcoal and tea buns, and all the while you were asking yourself what sort of woman I was." Her voice remained level, but something in it had gone thin as drawn wire. "Did you make notes in your mind, Your Grace? Did you score me for civility, for common manners, for whether I spoke well enough to a stranger who had nothing?" "Miss Holt," he began. "No." She lifted one hand, and that small motion stopped him more completely than anger might have done. "You will not soften this by calling me Miss Holt in that tone. I have had enough softening for one evening." He took the rebuke because he had earned it. More than that, he understood with a painful clarity that this was the first wholly honest conversation they had ever had, because at last she knew where she stood and what had been done to her. He had wanted truth unclouded by title. Here it was now, and it hurt exactly as truth ought when one has behaved badly. Frances looked not at the seal, nor at Penrith, nor at the open case, but directly at Silas. "You wished to know whether a woman could be decent when there was nothing to gain." Very well. You had your answer every day you walked through that door. What you did not trouble to ask, because it was your comfort at stake and not mine, was what it might cost another person to be watched in innocence by a man who had already made her part of his experiment. Mrs. Bell drew in a breath. Penrith closed his eyes. Silas said, low, "I know I wronged you." "Do you?" Frances asked. "Do you know it in the way a man knows a fact on paper? Or do you know it in the way one feels shame in the bones? Because I think those are different knowings, and I should like, just once, not to be required to do the labor of telling a gentleman the size of the bruise he has left." That struck him cleanly. It was not cruel. It was exact. He tried again, and this time without defense. "I told myself I wanted honesty. I told myself I had been made a bargain of too often, and that if I came here as no one, I might find one unbought human regard in the world. I see now what vanity there was in that. I asked for openness while hiding behind every advantage I possessed. I made your goodness answer a question you had never agreed to hear." Frances's mouth trembled once, not with softness, but with contained hurt. "Yes, that is nearer." Then, after a beat, she said the thing he had not foreseen and should have. "I am ashamed." He stared at her. "You have nothing to be ashamed of." "Oh, but I do." Her voice dropped almost to a whisper, and that whisper was worse than anything louder could have been. "I spoke to you freely. I trusted you. I thought you were a lonely man making his way by decent work, and I let that matter to me. I let myself be glad when you came in. I looked for you, and all the while, you stood there with your hidden name and measured me. You may call it fear or caution or weariness with the world. I call it condescension dressed as sorrow." Silas flinched because there was truth in it. She drew herself up then, gathering dignity around her like a cloak. "You will leave my shop." Penrith moved as if to speak, perhaps to plead urgency, perhaps to drag practical danger between them like a screen. Mrs. Bell's glance silenced him. There are moments when practicality is only cowardice in better tailoring. Silas did not argue. "If Adrian troubles you again—" "He will," Frances said, "and that too is because of you." The words landed and stayed. He bowed his head once. Then he closed the leather case, wrapped the seal, gathered the papers, and turned toward the door. He had almost reached it when Frances spoke again, not loudly, not to stop him, but as a woman naming the last fact plainly because plainness was all she had left. "If he means to inherit by your death," she said, "then I am now the woman who knows you live." Outside, in the wet dark beyond the glass, a figure had just paused under the lamp across the street and was looking directly in. Silas saw the figure at the lamp and knew at once that remaining even a minute longer would be one theft more. The man across the street did not skulk. That was the worst of it. He stood with the false patience of someone instructed merely to notice, not to interfere. Rain glistened on the brim of his hat. Once, as a cart rolled between them, he shifted just enough for the light to catch the pale oval of his face. Local, perhaps, but hired. The sort of fellow who could carry a rumor from one public house to another with the ease of a man carrying coals. Mrs. Bell followed his gaze and made a small sound through her nose. "There, then, we have moved from discomfort to witnesses." Penrith was on his feet again. "Your Grace, you cannot stay." Frances did not speak. That silence behind him was harder to bear than Penrith's urgency. If she had ordered him out, the order would have had justice in it, and perhaps even mercy. But she said nothing. She had withdrawn the gift of easy speech, and he felt the lack of it like cold through wet cloth. He turned back into the room. The little shop had become unbearable to him in all the ways it had lately become dear. The lamp on the counter, the shell paperweight, the shelf of travel books with one volume always crooked because the board beneath it had warped, the faint sweetness of old paste and paper, and the remnant smell of tea buns from the children's lesson. He had entered this place as a tired man hiding from his own name. He was leaving it as something much worse, a man who had made sanctuary dangerous for the person who kept it. "Miss Holt," he said. She lifted her eyes to him at last. "I will go now, before that fellow can be sure of what he has seen, if indeed he is sure already. Penrith will come with me. Mrs. Bell?" "Will do as she pleases," said Mrs. Bell crisply, "which at present includes remaining exactly where impropriety cannot be imputed to me and incompetence to you." The rebuke landed on all available heads and improved no one's temper, which was perhaps its purpose. Silas inclined his head. "Quite right." He looked again at Francis. There were 100 things in him all at once: apology, longing, shame, the old reflex to explain, the newer knowledge that explanation is often only vanity asking to be comforted. He chose the smallest and truest thing available. "I am sorry." Her face did not soften. It would have been an insult if it had. "Yes," she said, "I believe you are." He accepted that, too. Penrith began gathering the letters back into the leather case with brisk solicitor's hands, but Francis stopped him with a glance. "Not all of them." He froze. She pointed to one folded packet tied in faded ribbon. "Those are mine." "They concern the estate," Penrith said. "They were brought into my shop," she replied, "and I think I have earned the right to know what sort of danger has been laid on my counter." Penrith looked to Silas. Silas said, "Leave them." The solicitor obeyed, though unwillingly. Francis laid her fingertips on the packet, not opening it yet, merely claiming it. That gesture, small and calm, stirred something like hope and dread together in Silas. She was not casting the truth back at once. She was keeping it. Whether to judge, expose, defend, or destroy, he could not know. For the first time since coming to the town, something essential had passed wholly out of his management. The choice in her hands. It ought to have been there from the beginning. Outside, wheels rattled over the wet stones. The watcher under the lamp had moved closer by a yard or two. Penrith snapped the case shut. Mrs. Bell said, "My side lane, if you have any sense left." "I am trying to discover whether I have," Silas answered. This, unexpectedly, won from her the briefest flash of approval. "Well, keep trying." Francis stepped back from the counter, giving him passage to the door. She did not move further away than that. She did not grant closeness either. It was an exact distance. He felt with a painful clarity that she was already altering the shape of her life to exclude him from its easy part. At the threshold he paused only once more, only to look, because he knew he might not be allowed another chance. She stood in the lamplight with one hand on the packet of letters, her face pale and steady, the shelves of the circulating library rising behind her like mute witnesses. Then he went out into the wet night. Mrs. Bell's carriage took the lane behind the chapel, narrow and half-flooded, the wheels sucking at the mud. Penrith sat opposite him, clutching the leather case to his knees. Through the small fogged glass, Silas could see almost nothing but blurred lamps and dark hedges streaming with rain. Yet even in that obscurity, he could not leave the little shop behind. He saw over and over Francis's hand resting on the packet. Penrith cleared his throat. "Your Grace, she knows enough now to undo Adrian." Silas looked at him. The solicitor, perhaps hearing how ugly the sentence sounded once spoken aloud, amended it. "Or to save you." "No," Silas said quietly. "She knows enough now to choose what to do with the truth. That is not the same thing." The carriage lurched. Somewhere behind them, faint but distinct through the rain, another set of wheels had taken the same lane. The wheels behind them kept coming. That was the devilish part of it. No wild chase, no cracked whip, no obvious pursuit fit for stories. Only another carriage, steady in the rain, taking each turn after theirs with a patience that said it did not need to hurry because it did not mean to lose them. The lane smelled of wet hedge, churned mud, and the iron tang of soaked harness. Inside Mrs. Bell's little carriage, the lamp swung once and painted brief gold across Penrith's worried face and the closed leather case on his knees. Silas listened. Once a man has lived long enough under expectations, he learns the sounds of pressure before he sees its form. A groom knows a lame hoof by cadence. A hunted man learns the same of wheels. Penrith heard it too. "They are following." "Yes." "Shall I tell the driver to turn toward the post road?" "No." Silas looked through the fogged glass at almost nothing. Too open. The solicitor swallowed whatever further objection he had. He was a brave enough man in offices and courts, and brave enough on behalf of other people's interests, but rain-black lanes and unnamed watchers were not his proper country. Silas thought, with a bitterness entirely earned, that none of this would have become necessary if he had been brave in the right place weeks earlier, which was to say, honest. Back at the library, Frances had bolted the door only after the carriage had vanished into the rain. Mrs. Bell stayed with her without fuss, taking off her damp gloves and setting them by the range in the tiny back kitchen as if she had always intended to settle in for the evening. Some kindnesses arrive with speeches, others hang up their bonnet and ask where the tea-caddy is. Frances, who had been holding herself upright by will alone, was more grateful for the second kind. She did not cry. That came later. First, she took the packet of letters from where she had laid it on the table and sat under the lamp with it before her, not yet opened. The room around her was small and overfamiliar. The cracked blue bowl by the sink, the worn rag rug her father had once sworn still had 10 years left in it, the shelf of cups with mismatched handles. Yet everything had altered. The back room where children had drawn clouds that afternoon was now the back room where a duke had admitted he had come to measure her heart under a false name. The counter in the shop was still only wood, and yet it had held a gold seal and papers tied with red tape and a truth large enough to crush a woman's good name if another man chose to turn it. Mrs. Bell set a cup of tea by her elbow. "Drink that before it grows opinions." Frances obeyed because obedience, in certain kinds of shock, is a mercy. The tea was strong, oversteeped, faintly smoky. It steadied her hands. "At my age," said Mrs. Bell, "I have met fools of nearly every rank. You need not look so astonished that yours should prove titled." A laugh escaped Frances then, thin and unwilling and near tears. "I am not astonished he is titled. I am astonished I mattered enough to be tested." Mrs. Bell's expression sharpened. "No, do not help him there. That is wounded vanity talking, and men have plenty of that without borrowing ours. You mattered because you were there, and kind, and unguarded. He used what was nearest. That is the whole of the ugliness." Frances looked down at the packet. Her own name, in Penrith's hand, stood on the outer fold. Beneath it, in a smaller notation, papers relevant to any person able to attest to the continued life of His Grace, the Duke of Wexmoor. The words chilled her, not because she cared for grandeur, because they made her reel to danger in an official hand. "One learns a great deal about people," she said after a while, "from what they think they may do without asking." Mrs. Bell gave a single approving nod. "Yes." Frances broke the seal. Inside were copies of notices, legal memoranda, fragments of correspondence, and one short statement from Penrith outlining the present position of Adrian Vale. The cousin had been received by tenants, had begun discussing estate matters as if succession were settled, and had taken pains to confirm the drowning wherever doubt lingered. A final note, hastily added, made Frances go cold. If any witness emerges unexpectedly, it may be prudent to consider the management of that witness before gossip spreads beyond recovery. "Management," she said aloud. Mrs. Bell took the page, read it, and her mouth hardened. "That means ruin if it can be managed quietly, slander if it cannot, and perhaps a marriage rumor if someone thinks that will soil you fastest." Frances sat very still. There it was, plain at last. Not vague danger, but method. A woman alone, keeper of a failing shop, known to have harbored a gentleman under a false name. It would not take much. One whisper placed correctly, one smile in the wrong drawing room, one suggestion that Miss Holt had been entertaining a man in private under circumstances better left undescribed. And subscriptions would thin, mothers would hesitate, respectable callers would cross the street instead of entering by her bell. Outside, the rain had almost stopped. The town was settling into that wet midnight quiet in which every cart on the road sounds singular. Mrs. Bell folded the paper and laid it down. "My dear, by tomorrow he will know you know." Frances lifted her head. At that exact moment, from the shop beyond the kitchen passage, came the delicate metallic sound of someone trying the front door latch very gently, as if hoping the house might still be unwary enough to open itself. The latch gave one more cautious stir, then stopped. Frances and Mrs. Bell looked at one another across the little kitchen table. Neither woman spoke at once. The house had gone so quiet that Frances could hear the faint drip of rain from the shop awning and the tiny dry hiss of the lamp flame. On the table before her lay the opened packet, its papers spread like a hand of unwelcome cards. She felt, absurdly, that even breathing too loudly might tell the person beyond the door more than she wished told. Mrs. Bell rose first. Age had stiffened her knees, not her nerve. She took up the iron poker from beside the range and said, in a voice no higher than usual, "If this turns out to be the milkman, I shall feel very theatrical." "It is not the milkman," Frances said. "No, milkmen knock like men who expect to be answered." They moved together through the passage and into the darkened shop. Frances kept the lamp turned low. The shelves stood in shadow, rows of silent backs and dim gilt, familiar things made strange by watchfulness. At the front window she paused and looked through the slit in the curtain. No face waited there. Only the wet shine of the street, the blurred lamp beyond, and a narrow shape slipping round the corner at the end of the row. Too quick to identify, too deliberate to be chance. Mrs. Bell did not waste time on fear. "Bar the door properly." Frances slid the second bolt into place. Her hands were steady now, which surprised her. Perhaps steadiness is only fear that has found work to do. She turned then and looked at her own shop with the odd, estranged feeling one has after illness, as if ordinary objects had kept one set of meanings until dusk and another after dark. The subscription ledger lay half open. Tom Harker's lopsided boat still rested on the back table where he had left it to dry. A duke had stood here. A watcher had tried the latch. Somewhere in the town, men were deciding what could be made of her. Back in the lane behind the chapel, the second carriage followed for nearly half a mile before losing them. Mrs. Bell's driver knew the lanes better than the men behind. Twice he turned where a stranger would have gone straight. Once he cut through a yard behind a cooper's shed, and once he halted without warning under the lee of an empty warehouse while the other wheels passed on ahead in the dark. When they reached the small lodging Penrith had taken under another name, the horse was steaming and the carriage lamps were filmed with mud. Silas got down first. The place was mean enough, 2 rooms above a cooper's yard, stairs smelling of damp wood, cabbage, and lamp oil, but secrecy often rents poor quarters. Penrith shut the door behind them and set the case on a narrow bed with more care than if it held silver. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Penrith said, "You see now that she cannot simply be left to weather this." Silas turned from the rain-blurred window. "I have seen nothing else for 6 hours." The solicitor, tired and cold and less deferential than rank usually permitted, faced him squarely. "Then do not begin talking to me of returning north at once, or of meeting Adrian first, or of any other grand corrective that still leaves Miss Holt unshielded. The lady knows enough to be useful to you and dangerous to him. That is the most exposed condition in England. Useful to you, dangerous to him. The words sickened him because of how true they were, and because in another mouth they might have sounded merely practical. He was past the right to prefer comfort in speech. "What would you have me do?" Penrith hesitated only a second. "Tell her everything, in writing, plainly. Give her the whole of it before Adrian or gossip gives her some twisted remnant, and then leave the matter where it ought always to have been. In her hands. Yes." Silas sat down hard in the one wooden chair. The room was cold enough that the ink on the little table had skinned over. He thought of Frances under her lamp with the packet before her, of the look in her face when she had understood not merely that he was a duke, but that he had made her unwitting subject to his doubt. There are injuries born of insult, and others born of unequal knowledge. The latter cut deeper because they humble memory itself. One begins to distrust not only the deceiver, but one's own honest past feeling. He covered his eyes briefly with one hand. "If I write, I may lose her entirely." Penrith answered with more gentleness than he often showed, "My lord, you have already arranged matters so that keeping silent may lose her more completely." Silas lowered his hand. Down below, somewhere in the cooper's yard, a dog barked once and was silent. Rain ticked from the eaves. The room smelled of wet wool and cheap soap. At last he reached for the pen. And in the library, at almost that same hour, Frances unfolded one last paper from the packet and found, written across the bottom in a hurried, unfamiliar hand, 3 words that made her blood run cold. "Watch the Morning Post." Frances did not cry out. It was because fear, when it has been made to live with respectability for years, learns to keep its voice down. She set the paper with the warning upon the table, rose from her chair, and stood listening with Mrs. Bell in the dark little shop while the latch settled back into silence. No second attempt came. No knock followed. Whoever had tested the door had done so lightly, almost politely, as if wishing only to know whether the house within slept carelessly. "It is enough," Mrs. Bell said at last. "He knows where to press." Frances looked toward the curtained glass, beyond which there was only the wet gleam of the street and the black shapes of shuttered windows. "He? My dear, men like Adrian never do their own trying of latches." The older woman set the poker down by the counter and drew the curtain fully across. "They send out hands. The hands are vulgar. The intention rarely is." That sat with Frances because it was true. She had been thinking, in her private anger, of Silas as the chief author of all this. And he was, in one sense. His lie had opened the door. Yet beyond that lie there moved another will entirely, colder and more practical. A man who did not need her esteem, only her silence. A man who would not care whether she had been kind to children, careful with old books, dutiful to her father's memory, or tired to the bone. He would care only whether she might be made inconvenient. They did not sleep much. Mrs. Bell took the settle in the back room and snored, delicately and with character, after 1 in the morning. Frances lay awake in her narrow bed under the eaves, listening to the house breathe around her. Water ticked in the gutter. Somewhere a board shifted with the damp. More than once she thought she heard footsteps in the street, but that may have been imagination made audible by darkness. What she did hear clearly, over and over, was Silas's voice saying he had come to find out what sort of woman she was before she knew what sort of man he was. The sentence went through her like a splinter. Not because it had ceased to hurt, but because pain, once admitted fully, becomes strangely exact. Toward dawn she rose, dressed by candlelight, and went down before the town woke. The shop smelled of old paper and last night's lamp smoke. In the gray window, the street was still nearly empty. She unlocked the door only when the post hour approached, and even then she kept the chain set until she saw who stood there. It was only Ned Pike, the post boy, thin as twine and always red-eyed in the mornings. He handed over 2 circulars, a fishing almanac for subscription, and 1 sealed letter directed in a hand Frances had not seen before, but recognized at once by instinct. There are letters that announce themselves before they are opened. This one did. Mrs. Bell, tying her bonnet ribbons by the shelf of sermons, saw Frances's face and said, "From him?" "Yes." "Will you read it alone?" Frances thought of saying yes. Instead, she said, "No. If I faint from rage, I prefer a witness." That won from Mrs. Bell the smallest huff that might almost have been amusement. They went into the back room. Morning light came weakly through the little window, showing every crack in the plaster and every watermark on the sill. Frances broke the seal. Inside was page after page, written close and steadily. No flourishes, no grand appeals, no attempt, at first glance at least, to charm. She began to read. He had written everything. He wrote the bare facts already known, that he had lived, vanished, worn another name, and been found, and more. He wrote of the false death report and the moment he chose not to deny it. He wrote of the wound to his pride that had taught him the wrong lesson about love. He wrote of his cousin's advantage, of Penrith's warnings, of the danger now hanging over her because she knew him living. He wrote, too, of the shabby honesty of the days by the sea, of teaching children to steady a horizon, of the first time she handed him a book without changing her manner for class or profit. And then, with no excuse left in him, he named the thing that mattered most, that he had taken from her the right to know whom she was trusting, and that no sorrow of his could make that just. Mrs. Bell was pretending not to watch her. Frances could feel the effort of it from across the table. At the end of the letter, the tone changed. It grew simpler still. He wrote that he would not come to her again unless she sent for him, that he would not attempt to see her, persuade her, defend himself in person, or use gratitude, danger, or rank to corner her choice. If she wished to expose him, she might. If she wished to remain silent, she might. If she wished him to return and set matters right publicly, she had only to send 1 line by Pike or Bell or Penrith. If she never wrote, he would take that as his answer and leave her free of him as far as he had power to do so. The choice in her hands. Frances read the last page twice, then a third time. At first she felt only fatigue, then anger again, but altered now by something more difficult. He was at last doing the one honest thing he had refused to do from the beginning. He was giving up command of the story. Mrs. Bell said quietly, "Well?" Frances folded the pages with great care. "He has placed his life, his name, and my ruin all in a letter," she said, "which is a very gentlemanly way of making me decide what kind of woman I am before breakfast." Then from the front shop came the bright crack of the bell, followed at once by a familiar, smooth male voice. "Miss Holt, I hope I am not too early." Frances folded the letter once and set it beneath her hand before she went out. There was no use pretending she did not know the voice. Adrian had chosen his hour with care. Morning callers are protected by daylight and convention. A man who enters a woman's shop at breakfast may claim innocence that midnight cannot. By the time Frances stepped into the front room, she had her face back in place, because women who keep businesses learn young that composure is stock in trade. Adrian Vale stood by the counter as if he had never yet been denied welcome in any room he chose to enter. He wore a dark coat still pearl-damp at the cuffs from the sea mist, and gloves so fine they looked absurd among subscription ledgers and circulating novels. He bowed when he saw her, and his expression arranged itself into solicitous concern. "Miss Holt, I feared I might be intruding." "You are," she said. It checked him, though only by a breath. Mrs. Bell came out behind her with deliberate slowness and began, without invitation, to sort a heap of returned pamphlets at the side table. It was a masterly act. She had made herself furniture, witness, and rebuke all at once. Adrian glanced at her and adjusted. "Mrs. Bell, a pleasure." "It is not," said Mrs. Bell without looking up. Frances might have loved her then if she had not already been too tired for new devotions. Adrian rested one gloved hand on the counter. "I have come only out of concern. There was some confusion yesterday, and I should dislike exceedingly for your house to be drawn into any unhappy whisper." "There is no confusion in my house," Frances said. "Only in the stories men choose to bring into it." He smiled, as if indulging spirit in a clever child. "Just so. Then let us speak plainly. A gentleman of uncertain identity has been seen in your company. Such things in a town of this size grow teeth very quickly. I should be sorry to see your good name exposed to gossip through no fault of your own." It was expertly done. No direct threat, only the suggestion of the world as a foul weather for which he, being experienced, could lend her a cloak. Frances felt the letter beneath her fingers as if it were warm. "You are very attentive to my good name," she said. "One tries to be useful." Mrs. Bell made a small, dry sound among the pamphlets. Frances held Adrian's eyes. "Then be useful elsewhere." The smile thinned. "Miss Holt, I do not think you quite understand your position." "No," she said quietly. "I think it is you who misunderstand it." That was the first moment he truly looked at her, and saw resistance where he had expected uncertainty, and something colder entered his face. "I wonder," he said, softer now, "whether you have had communications from the gentleman in question since last night." She did not answer. "That silence," he went on, "may be wiser than candor. I hope for your sake it is. The world is unkind to ladies drawn into adventures above their station. Even when they are wholly innocent, innocence is such a difficult thing to prove after the fact." There it was at last, the knife without the ribbon. Mrs. Bell turned then. "Sir, if you mean to blacken a woman under the name of protecting her, at least do not do it before breakfast. It is vulgar." Adrian ignored her. His gaze remained on Frances. "I can prevent unpleasantness, quietly, entirely, but I must know whether any letters, papers, or tokens have been left in your care." Frances thought of the pages under her hand in the back room, the long, plain confession, the final surrender, the choice in her hands. "No," she said. It was a lie, a clean one. It entered the air between them and stayed there. Adrian watched her so closely that for a moment she thought he must hear her heartbeat. Then he inclined his head. "I am relieved." He reached into his coat and drew out a folded printed sheet. "Since we are among truths, I should perhaps leave this. It may spare you confusion later." He slid it across the counter. Frances looked down. It was a notice for one of the county papers, set in proof. Formal, black-bordered, and headed with the words, "On the lamented death abroad of His Grace the Duke of Wexmoor, succession having lawfully passed, Her eyes moved lower. Adrian Vale's name stood there in print, calm and public and almost settled fact. "When that is published," he said gently, "contradiction will become difficult for anyone, particularly for a lady alone." Then he put on his gloves, bowed to her, nodded to Mrs. Bell, and went out into the morning mist. For a moment neither woman spoke. Then Mrs. Bell crossed to the window, looked after him, and said, "My dear, if you mean to summon the Duke, you had better do it before that notice reaches the post-coach." For a moment after Adrian left, the little bell above the door went on trembling in Francis's ear, as if he were still there. The shop had not changed. The same damp light lay over the shelves. The same wind pushed faintly at the window glass. Outside, a fish cart rattled past, and a dog barked twice in the lane. Yet everything in her had shifted 1 degree nearer decision. It is one thing to be warned in a letter, another to have the danger stand at your counter in polished boots and tell you, with perfect civility, how easily your life may be dirtied. Mrs. Bell picked up the proof sheet Adrian had left and held it away from her as though it might stain the fingers. "He means to settle the lie before lunch." Francis took it back and folded it carefully. Her hands were steady now in that curious way hands often are when the heart has become too tired for trembling. "Then he thinks I shall hesitate." "You do hesitate." "Yes," Francis said, "but not for the reason he supposes." She went into the back room and laid both papers side by side on the table, Adrian's printed notice and Silas's letter in his own hand. One was smooth, public, and cold. The other plain, private, and bruisingly honest. Between them lay the whole ugly shape of the choice. If she summoned him, she did not do it because she had been dazzled by a title. Indeed, the title had done most of the damage. If she remained silent, she might preserve pride at the expense of truth and leave a liar enthroned over a house that was not his. If she exposed all by herself without warning, she might turn scandal loose in ways that would wound everyone and free no one. Mrs. Bell stood in the doorway, bonnet on now, gloves buttoned, prepared to go out and be useful, which was her favorite condition. "What do you want?" Francis looked up. "That is a cruel question." "No," said the older woman. "It is the only one the world is always trying to prevent women from answering." Francis sat with that. It would have been easy, almost sweet in its way, to think only of injury. He had wronged her. He had studied her under false colors. He had taken trust while withholding the truth that would have changed every conversation between them. All of that remained. Yet beneath the anger, another fact had begun, against her will, to live alongside it. He had finally done one decent thing without reserve. He had put the whole matter out of his own hands and into hers. He had not commanded, coaxed, or claimed. He had yielded. That mattered. It did not erase what came before, but it mattered. "I want," she said slowly, "for the truth to stand in the room where the lie is standing. I want Adrian afraid of daylight. I want my shop left out of men's arrangements, and—" She stopped. Mrs. Bell waited. "And I want," Francis said more quietly, "to know whether the man who wrote that letter can be trusted when he no longer has the protection of a disguise." Mrs. Bell's expression softened only by a breath. "Then you do know what to do." Francis drew a sheet of paper toward her. The pen felt scratchy in her fingers. She thought absurdly of subscription notices, of overdue accounts, of all the harmless little notes she had written at this table. This one would bring a Duke back, or not. This one might alter her whole life again before evening. She began with no title at all. "Come at once," she wrote. "Not to the shop, to the back gate after dark, alone if you value my name. Bring whatever proof is needed to stop that notice and end this cleanly." She stared at the words. Then, after a long moment, she added one line more. "Do not mistake this summons for forgiveness." When she folded the note, her pulse was beating hard at last. Mrs. Bell took it, read only the outside direction, and nodded. "Good. That sounds like you, which is always safer than sounding noble." "Ned Pike," Frances said. "He can be trusted to carry a note if he is paid enough to feel important and not enough to feel criminal." Mrs. Bell almost smiled. "Excellent. You are recovering." By noon, the note was gone by the postboy's hand, tucked inside his satchel between circulars and a grocer's bill, and Frances had returned to the front shop because shops, unlike hearts, do not close merely because one's inner life has become impossible. She lent out 2 novels, took in 1 atlas, and answered Mrs. Cleeve's remarks about the weather as though weather were the chief concern of the day. All the while she listened for altered tones, for gossip arriving early, for the first crack in the town's ordinary face. It came sooner than she had expected. A young clerk from the printers passed the window carrying a fresh bundle of notices under his arm. He glanced in, saw her watching, and looked away too quickly. A minute later, Tom Harker came running up the street, breathless, cheeks blazing from cold and alarm. "Miss Holt," he gasped, skidding through the doorway. "There's a paper being nailed at the assembly rooms, and Mr. Vale's man says by tonight everyone will know who's dead, and who ought to stay that way." Frances did not waste time on alarm. There were hours for shock and hours for action, and when a child comes in white-faced with news carried from a public wall, action must do. Tom stood in the doorway, still panting, cap askew, rain on his lashes though the morning had turned almost clear. He was frightened for her in the blunt, whole-hearted way boys are frightened for the few adults they trust. Frances crossed to him at once, took him by the shoulders, and made her voice plain. "Who said it?" "Mr. Vale's man, the dark one with the scar by his ear. He was laughing with the printer's boy. He said by supper everybody'd know, and then he said—" Tom swallowed. "He said dead men should be left where they lie." Mrs. Bell had already reached for her gloves again. "There is your timetable." Frances's mind moved quickly now, not clearly perhaps, but quickly. The printed notice, the warning in the packet, Adrian's visit, the tested latch. One could almost admire the neatness of the pressure if one were not standing under it. He meant to fix the public story, spoil any private contradiction, and let shame do what force need not. A woman with a false gentleman in her shop, a duke dead abroad, a cousin grieving nobly. It was the sort of arrangement society swallows whole because it flatters everybody's assumptions. She bent to Tom. "You have done exactly right. Now you are to do one more thing for me and then forget for an hour that you know anything at all." His eyes widened. "Yes, miss." She took a scrap of paper from beside the ledger and wrote 3 lines, quick and firm. That note had already gone. This one was for Mrs. Bell's driver at the posting yard, instructing him to ride at once to the Cooper's lodging with a message that the back gate would be watched from dusk, and that if the Duke meant to come, he must come before the town had him spoken into death by print. She folded it, sealed it with plain wax, and put it into Tom's hand. "You are to give that to no one but Will Carter himself, not his boy, not his wife, not anyone who says they'll pass it on." Tom nodded with grave importance. "And if anyone asks where you've been?" "I was fetching a book for my aunt." "Good." She gave him a penny she could ill spare and watched him bolt back into the street like a released arrow. When the door shut behind him, Mrs. Bell said, "You are learning." "I have always known how to keep a shop," Frances answered. "I am only discovering that apparently it also requires tactics." The day dragged after that in a strange doubled fashion, outwardly ordinary and inwardly sharpened to a point. Customers came. A curate's wife returned a volume still uncut and asked whether Miss Holt had heard the sad county news. Frances said she had heard many county sad things and invited her to be specific. The woman, disappointed of sensation, bought hymn paper instead. Two fishermen argued over an atlas and forgot to pay until called back. A clerk from the printer's shop came in for ink and tried, too casually, to see whether any gentleman's correspondence lay upon the counter. Frances handed him the bottle and looked until he blushed. All the while, beyond the common small business of the day, a current ran beneath everything. She knew that if Silas came, the matter would cease to be hidden and become merely dangerous in the open. She knew, too, that if he did not come before Adrian's notice spread, truth would arrive too late and in the wrong shape. Yet the hardest thing was inward. She had summoned a man she had every reason to mistrust because the truth needed him present. That did not mean she had forgiven him. It did mean she believed he would come when called, and that belief, small and unwelcome and stubborn, told its own story about what remained alive in her despite everything. Toward afternoon, a reply reached her, not by post but by breathless messenger. Will Carter's youngest girl, hair escaping its ribbon, thrust a folded scrap into Frances's hand and whispered, "Pa said straight away." Then she darted out again before questions could catch her. The note inside was brief, in Penrith's hand. "He received your summons. He comes before nightfall. He insists on coming alone." Mrs. Bell read over her shoulder and clicked her tongue. Insists? Duke's a tiresome even when penitent. Frances folded the paper. Perhaps penitent dukes are worst of all. By 5, the town had begun to hum. Nothing open, nothing formal, only that change in the air when news has entered circulation and each person hopes to be the second rather than the first to repeat it. 2 young men paused too long outside the window. The grocer's wife, usually hearty, came in all sympathy and curiosity and left with neither satisfied. The printer's proof had not yet appeared on the assembly room board, but the expectation of it already walked the street. As dusk gathered, Frances shut the shop earlier than custom and went through the back room to the yard behind the library. The little gate opened onto an alley that smelled of wet brick, coal ash, and the sea beyond the houses. Mrs. Bell stood beside her in a dark shawl, refusing absolutely to go home. The light thinned. Somewhere a church clock struck the half-hour. Then footsteps sounded beyond the gate, one tread only, steady and unhurried, and just before Frances could lift the latch, another sound came from the alley mouth, a second pair of footsteps, lighter, quicker, and not trying in the least to hide. Frances held the latch and did not lift it. In the alley beyond the gate, the evening had thickened into that blue-gray half-light in which every sound seems nearer than it is. One tread waited directly outside, steady, familiar now to her ear after days of listening for it. The other pair of footsteps had checked at the alley mouth and then come on, not creeping, not rushing, only approaching with the insolent ease of someone who thinks he has a right to arrive anywhere at all. Mrs. Bell moved beside her and said under her breath, "If this is one of Adrian's creatures, I shall be obliged to disappoint him with my age." Frances almost smiled despite herself. Almost. Then she drew back the bolt and opened the gate just wide enough to let one man through. Silas stood there in the dusk, hatless, coat dark with mist, his face more drawn than when she had seen him last. Behind him, a few yards off at the alley mouth, stood the second figure. Penrith, breathing hard, mud to the hem of his coat, plainly having followed despite instructions. "I told you to come alone," Frances said at once. "I know," Silas answered. "I failed in that at once." He would not be put off. Penrith bowed with weary apology. "Miss Holt, forgive me. I come only because time is shorter than we supposed." Mrs. Bell opened the gate wider. "Then come in and waste none of it." They entered the yard, damp brick walls hemming them close. A line of washing, long forgotten, stirred faintly overhead. The sea could be heard beyond the houses, a low, continual breathing in the dark. Francis did not invite either man indoors, not yet. If what must be said could be said in the open yard, it was safer there, and cleaner. Silas stopped a few feet from her. He did not try to come nearer. That restraint, once ordinary, had become eloquent now. He held a packet of papers in one hand and a folded broadside in the other. "Tom Harker found me before Penrith did," he said. "I know about the notice." "Then you know Adrian means to have your death printed before your life can contradict it." "Yes." "And you have brought what proof is needed?" He lifted the packet slightly. "Everything I could gather fastest. Identity papers, seals, letters in my hand known to the steward and magistrate, notices from Penrith, and a signed statement from the captain who saw me after the wreck and failed, by blunder and delay, to make himself believed in time." Penrith added, "If we can get before the printer and the magistrate tonight, and before Adrian fixes the thing publicly at the assembly rooms, the lie breaks where it stands." Francis looked from one to the other. "And my name?" Silas answered at once. First. It was the swiftness of that answer, not the word itself, that went through her. He took a sheet from the packet and held it out. "Before anything else, I have written and signed an acknowledgment that any concealment, impropriety of appearance, or public misunderstanding connected to my presence here arose entirely from my own deception. It states plainly that you acted at all times in ignorance of my identity and with irreproachable conduct. Penrith has prepared copies for the magistrate, the printer, and any person in town whose opinion carries weight enough to do harm." Francis took the page. Even in the failing light, she could see his signature at the bottom, firm and unmistakable. She read enough to know he had done exactly what he said. No softening, no evasions, no shelter for himself built out of her silence. Mrs. Bell, reading over her shoulder with her usual disregard for privacy where justice was concerned, gave a brisk nod. "Better. He is at last learning to use rank the way God intended, which is to clean up his own mess." A flicker, brief as a struck match, crossed Silas's face. Humility, perhaps, or the ghost of humor under strain. Then he looked only at Francis again. "I will do whatever you require," he said. "Appear publicly tonight. Go straight to the magistrate. Sign more. Stand beside you while you denounce me if that is what protects you best. I am not asking anything except instruction." She felt the truth of that, and it made things harder, not easier. Because there is a relief in righteous anger that disappears the moment the other person stops defending himself. One is left then with the more difficult burden of deciding what justice actually asks. "You are not to stand beside me," she said. "Not as if I were under your wing. If we do this, you follow my lead in this town. You speak when I say speak. You answer what is asked. And if any man hints that I trapped, lured, or schemed for your notice, you stop him in the first breath and with your whole name." "I swear it." She held up the signed page. "And this goes first to the printer." Penrith breathed out. "Good." "Necessary," Francis said. Then she turned to Silas once more, and her voice changed, not softer, but deeper, as if it had reached the place beneath anger where the truth lived without ornament. "You wrote that you would come if summoned and ask nothing," she said. "I believe you now. Do not make me foolish for believing it." His answer came low and steady. "I would sooner make myself nothing at all." At the alley mouth, sudden voices rose from the street beyond, men calling to one another, quick and excited. and then the unmistakable slap of fresh paper being pasted against wood. The sound of paste meeting wood sent all four of them moving at once. Frances shut the gate behind them and crossed the yard without waiting to see whether the men followed. Mrs. Bell, astonishingly quick for a woman who had spent the afternoon denouncing everyone's judgment, took the lead through the back door and into the dark passage. Silas came after Frances, not beside her, keeping the exact distance she had demanded. Penrith, clutching the packet of proofs and signed papers under his arm, muttered something about magistrates, printers, injunctions, and the ruinous habit of public notices to spread faster than truth. By the time they reached the front of the shop, the voices outside had grown louder. A little knot of townspeople had already gathered by the assembly room rail across the street, drawn as people always are to a fresh sheet pasted where all may read it. Lamps were being lit one by one along the row, and their glow shone wetly on hats, shawls, and curious faces. Frances did not look at the crowd first. She looked at the printer's boy, still standing on the step with his pot of paste and brush, and at the dark man with the scar at his ear beside him. Adrian's messenger, the same one Tom had seen. "Open the shop," she said. Penrith blinked. "Miss Holt, perhaps it would be wiser—" "To hide?" she said without turning. "He has done enough arranging of my appearances. I think I shall choose this one myself." Mrs. Bell gave a short sound of approval. Silas said nothing, but something in his face changed, some mixture of dread and respect and the knowledge that he was now entirely in another person's hands. Frances lifted the bar, opened the door wide, and stepped out onto the threshold of her circulating library, as if it were a stage she had never wanted and would nevertheless occupy properly. The evening air struck cool against her face. The crowd across the way shifted, heads turned. The boy looked suddenly as if he would have preferred to be delivering flour. "Who authorized that notice?" Frances asked. The scarred man smiled with only one side of his mouth. "County business, miss. No concern of yours." "It is my concern if lies are being posted opposite my window." That sentence carried farther than she intended. A murmur ran through the cluster at the rail. The boy with the paste pot glanced helplessly from Frances to the man beside him. Silas remained just within the open door, where the lamplight touched one shoulder and left the rest of him in shadow. It was a powerful position and a dangerous one. Half concealed, not declared, a rumor waiting for a face. Penrith hovered behind with the signed statement ready, and Mrs. Bell came to stand at Frances's left like a stern domestic saint of common sense. The scarred man laughed, a little too loudly. "You should be careful, miss. People may think you know more of county business than is proper." "People may think what they like once they have the facts," Frances said. Then she turned, not to the crowd, not yet, but toward the open door. "Your Grace." It was the first time she had used the title aloud before witnesses. The lane, the shops, the little gathering under the lamps, all seemed to hold still. Silas stepped out. No flourish attended it, no proclamation, only a man walking from shadow into the street he had once inhabited as nobody and now re-entered as himself. Yet the effect of it was like a pane of glass breaking without sound. The boy made a noise in his throat. Two women at the rail caught each other's sleeves. Someone said, "Lord preserve us," under his breath. The scarred man's face lost color so fast it was almost ugly. Silas did not look at the crowd. He looked first at Frances, as if to be certain he still moved under her leave, and only then at the notice half pasted to the board. "In my hearing," he said, his voice carrying easily in the damp evening, "no false death notice concerning me will be posted or repeated. Mr. Penrith, if you please." The solicitor came forward at once and produced the signed statement, the identity papers, the captain's letter, the seal, each document like a blow landing in orderly sequence. He handed copies first to the printer's boy, who accepted them with shaking fingers, then to the town constable, who had just pushed through the little crowd, breathless and bewildered by the sight before him. Frances watched all of it with a strange stillness in herself. This, then, was what power looked like when it obeyed instead of arranged. This was what it might have looked like from the beginning if he had been brave enough to come honestly. The scarred man tried one last thing. "A convenient imposture," he said, though his voice had lost conviction. "Anyone might claim—" "You will stop there," Silas said, and there was in him now the old authority she had feared and the newer humility that kept it from becoming cruelty. "You have threatened Miss Holt's good name under orders from Adrian Vale. You will now hear, before these witnesses, that any concealment, deception, or impropriety in her connection to me was mine alone, wholly unknown to her, and that I will answer in court or in print to any man who says otherwise." He handed the statement to the constable. The crowd had gone very quiet. That quiet was not belief yet. It was something almost as important. It was attention-turning. And from the far end of the street came the sharp rattle of a fast carriage pulling up hard before the assembly rooms, followed by Adrian Vale stepping down into the lamplight. Adrian saw them all at once. The lamplight from the assembly rooms fell across his face as he stepped down from the carriage, and for the briefest instant the smooth arrangement of it broke. A lesser man might have started or cursed. Adrian only stopped with one foot still on the step, and let his eyes travel from the half-pasted notice to the constable holding Penrith's papers, to Silas standing alive in the street, and finally to Frances on her own threshold. In that pause he took the whole measure of his ruin and began, even then, to calculate what shape of retreat would best preserve his dignity. People turned toward him with that quick collective motion crowds have when they sense the true point of a story has just arrived. "Cousin," Adrian said, recovering the smoothness by sheer habit, "this is astonishing." Silas did not answer at once. Frances noticed that. The old duke, the man reared to command rooms, might once have stepped forward and made this moment his by birthright. The man standing there now waited half a heartbeat, looked once to her, and only then said, "You have published my death rather prematurely." A laugh, nervous, surprised, grateful for any line to laugh at, moved through the watchers. Adrian chose charm. Of course he did. "My dear fellow, had I known—" "No," said Frances. Her voice cut across the street more cleanly than his polish had. A few heads turned back to her. Adrian's eyes narrowed by a fraction. She came down one step from the library door, the signed statement in her hand. "You did know enough to threaten my reputation in case I spoke. You knew enough to send men to test my door. You knew enough to hurry that notice to print before truth could overtake it. I should be obliged if we did not waste this town's evening pretending grief and ignorance have met here by accident." That was not how women were expected to speak in public to polished men, which was precisely why it worked. Convention, once broken by the right person at the right hour, often leaves the oppressor with fewer weapons than he had a minute before. Adrian could not chide her without seeming a bully, nor dismiss her without appearing afraid, nor lean on gallantry now that Silas had publicly cleared her name before the crowd. The constable, emboldened by numbers and paper, cleared his throat. "Mr. Vale, I have here statements, seals, witness letters, and an affirmation from His Grace himself. I believe no death notice will be posted this night." Adrian's jaw tightened. "I am sure no one wishes for vulgar scenes." "Then you should not have arranged one," said Mrs. Bell from the doorway, to the delight of two shopgirls near the rail who instantly looked as if they would remember this moment all their lives. Penrith, whose proper country was finally under his feet, stepped forward with calm, deadly competence. He named names, dates, the wreck report, the captain's correction, the delayed dispatches, the first inquiries made by Adrian in county offices, the attempt to settle succession before adequate proof. He did not rant. He documented. There are few things more chilling to a vain man than accurate paperwork read aloud among witnesses. Adrian made one last effort. He spread his hands slightly and said, "I acted on the best information available. If a misunderstanding has occurred, it is regrettable. As for Miss Holt, I have visited only from concern that an unmarried lady might be damaged by association with a gentleman hiding his identity in a provincial town." There it was, his final refuge. If he could not deny the Duke's life, he might still stain the woman who had inconveniently known it. Silas's answer came at once and without heat, which made it all the more decisive. "Any concealment was mine. Any damage attempted was yours. Miss Holt knew nothing of my name until I confessed it myself. She is under my public protection in this matter only because I exposed her to it. And I say before every person here that any word against her conduct is a falsehood I will answer for personally." The words landed with the full weight of title used at last as shield rather than test. Adrian looked from Silas to Francis and understood, perhaps for the first time, that he had lost not merely an inheritance of land, but the moral arrangement of the scene. The crowd no longer watched a grieving heir inconvenienced by confusion. It watched one man who had sinned, confessed, and stood corrected, and another who had tried to profit by death and frighten a woman into silence. Somewhere behind the rail, Tom Harker whispered audibly, "That's the wrong sort of boat sinking." No one hushed him. Adrian drew himself up, every line of him resentful and controlled. "Very well," he said. "If this is the posture the evening chooses, I shall not contest it in the street." He turned to go back to his carriage. Then Francis spoke once more. "Mr. Vale?" He stopped. She held up the printed proof he had left her that morning. "You forgot this in my shop. I think the street should hear how kindly you propose to manage me before you retire." And before he could stop her, she unfolded the paper and began to read. Francis read Adrian's own words into the damp evening air, and with each line the shape of the matter changed beyond recall. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The street had gone so quiet that the brush in the printer's boy's hand could be heard dripping paste onto the boards. She read the phrases Adrian had left her that morning, his concern for her reputation, his wish to prevent unpleasantness, his insistence that any papers in her care be surrendered quietly for her own protection. In private, such language might have slithered by under the name of prudence. Spoken aloud before shopkeepers, fishermen, clerks, and the constable, it sounded exactly as it was, a rich man's attempt to frighten a woman into helping him bury the truth. Adrian made no move to stop her. He could not. To interrupt would confirm, to deny would be useless. By the time she lowered the sheet, the crowd was no longer divided between curiosity and doubt. It had chosen its understanding. A lie can travel far when no one feels its weight. Once the weight is handed round, people know what they are holding. The constable stepped forward first. "Mr. Vale," he said, awkward with the formality and yet steady in it, "I must ask you to come inside with these papers and answer certain questions proper and immediate." Adrian looked at Silas, not at the constable. "You would have me handled in a market street?" Silas answered, and the answer was plain enough to end the performance. "I would have the matter handled where you chose to begin it." That was the close of it, only the very public shrinking of a man who had lived by private leverage. Adrian gave a short laugh that convinced no one, handed his gloves to his servant as if the whole thing were an inconvenience of weather, and went with the constable toward the assembly rooms, where the magistrate had already been sent for. The printer's boy, white to the lips, tore the half-pasted death notice from the board before anyone had to tell him twice. The little crowd began to dissolve almost at once. People muttered, stared, bowed uncertainly, and moved off in clumps to carry the corrected story faster than the false one had been meant to spread. Mrs. Bell, satisfied now that justice had at least put its boots on, went inside to put the kettle on as if the night had merely required a stronger tea than usual. And Frances remained on the library threshold. Silas did not come nearer until the street had emptied. Penrith had gone with the magistrate's papers. The lamps burned low in their glass. The sea beyond the town sounded patient and dark. He stood in the road, no longer hidden, no longer retreating, and waited. It was she who crossed the distance. Enough. "The notice is stopped," she said. "Yes." "My name is safe." "Yes." "You did as I asked." He looked at her then with the whole worn truth of himself in his face. "I should have done it before you ever had to ask." There are apologies that plead to be accepted, and apologies that simply lay themselves down and let the other person step past them or not. This was the second kind. Frances felt the last of her anger change shape. It remained. One does not become foolish in a single evening. But change. It was no longer a wall. It was a thing behind her, real and instructive, and no longer governing where she stood. "You may return to Wexmore now," she said. The words hit him visibly, though he bowed his head to them. "If that is your wish?" "It is my expectation," she said. "A duke who has learned anything at all ought to go and put his own house in order." He almost smiled. "That sounds very like dismissal." "It is not," Frances said, and now at last her voice altered. The hardness in it gave way to something quieter, more dangerous, because it was nearer hope. "Dismissal would have been never sending for you. This is instruction. There is a difference." He lifted his head fully. She went on because this too had to be plain. "I do not forgive quickly. I do not trust cheaply. You asked once, in the worst possible way, to be known apart from your title. I knew that man. He was real. He was also tangled up with pride and secrecy and damage done to me. Both things are true. If there is to be anything between us, it begins after this, with no disguise, no experiments, and no debt." His face, which had been held so carefully for so many weeks, opened then in a way she had not seen before. Relief so deep it was almost pain. "In that world," he said quietly, "I would come to you honestly." "In that world," Frances answered, "you may come back when your business is finished and ask." The sea wind moved the hem of her dress. Somewhere behind them in the back room, one of Tom Harker's unfinished sketches slid from the table and whispered to the floor. A person is not proved by the grand moment alone, nor by the title, nor by the clever hiding place he once chose. Better proof lies in the hand that finally signs its own fault plain, in the door opened without demand, in the posted lie stripped from the board before it dries hard enough to stay. Later, much later, when the street was empty and the lamps were smoking down, Frances went back into the shop and found the fallen sketch. The boat on it was crooked, oversized, and absurdly brave against a sea the child had drawn much too dark. "If you'd like, leave a note and tell me whether you stayed angry with him. And subscribe if you want another long story soon."